Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbos very famously discusses, the nature of Chanukah as a holiday, as a celebration, and this begins with the Brisa on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. The Brisa says, "My Chanukah." What is Chanukah? It's a very strange beginning of a, a section in the Talmud. What do you mean, my Chanukah? Everybody is familiar with what the holiday is all about. Even in early times, the Chanukah was a very the Pirsa Manes of Chanukah was effective, and it was a well-known holiday. So when we say my Chanukah, it's peculiar. We don't typically begin a brisa in this way. So I think what the Gemara is really asking is, in a situation where there are like multiple components of a certain institution or a holiday, the question is like, what is the essential Hanukkah? And that's why this becomes a very important brisa, because as we know, there are different, roughly speaking, 50%, of our focus is on the military victory of the Chashmonaim, something that the Rambam elaborates in the beginning of his treatment of Hilchos Chanukah in Parag Gimel, Hilchos Chanukah Halacha Aleph. The Rambam gives the back history of Chanukah in his own way. It's based on different records and different formulations, especially in the Medrash. So the Bayis Sheni Keshemolchu Yavon, in Bayis Sheni, the Second Commonwealth, when Yavon, when Greece, ruled that part, the Gazru Gzeros al Yisrael, they imposed decrees on Klal Yisrael. Ubitlu datam, that's a very important phrase. We'll get back to it. They literally tried to cancel their religious activities and their religious practices. Some lasuk b'Torah mitzvos, did not permit them to fulfill or to practice again the study of Torah, the performance of mitzvos. Who pashtu yadam b'mamonam, and they took liberties with their finances. Bibno sehem, violated their daughters. V'nichnasu laheichal, and then they entered into the inner precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, who partzu pratzos, pirtzos, and they broke through. They invaded these holy sites. The timu taharos, and they also took the pure oil and other important entities of the Beis Hamikdash, and they defiled them. The Tzar Lahem Yisrael Ma'od, and they were very much persecuting Klal Yisrael. Mipneim v'lochatzum lachatz gadol, and they imposed pressured situations upon them. Acharicham aleim alekei avosenu, until God took Rachmanos, mercy on Klal Yisrael. V'yitzilam v'gavru, and he voshiam miyadam, saved them from their hands. V'yitzilam v'gavru b'nei Chashmonai kohanim hagadolim, and the Chashmonaim, who were from the family of the Kohen Gadol. V'hargum v'hoshio Yisrael b'yadam v'hemidu melech min hakohanim v'chazra malchus Yisrael ad al-masayim shana ad korban hasheni. There was like a 200-year rule of the Chashmonaim. The Rambam embraces this idea. The Ramban, in his commentary on Parshas Vayechi, on the pasuk La Yasser Shevet Yehuda, that the Shvatim are all supposed to be under the kingship of Judah, of the tribe of Yehuda. So the Ramban is very critical of the Chashmonaim for setting themselves up as king. But the Rambam actually seems to embrace the Malchus of the Chashmonaim, at least as a temporary phenomenon, and that 200-year period until the Churban Bayis Sheni. So this is the backstory of Chanukah that appears in the Rambam. And then, the Gemara makes, again, much briefer mention of this if you look carefully. So the Gemara that I began with, my Chanukah, what is Chanukah? The Ton Rabbanon, the Chafei Kislev on the 25th day of Kislev, Yomi de Chanukah Timanya Inun. The days of Chanukah are 8 days of Chanukah. This is in Aramaic. The lo mispod bahon, udelo lihisanos bahon. Days in which there should be no eulogizing and there should be no fasting. Chanukah belongs to a category called Megillas Tainis. It was like a list of days in which miracles had taken place, which were forbidden, to be turned into fast days and eulogies, except for of Talmidei Chachamim, were not permitted on those days either, because these were tended to be days of joy and celebration, which would be marred by either fasting or eulogizing. And one of these one of these miracles that was celebrated was the miracle of Chanukah. So this phrase, "B'chafei b'kislev yomi de Chanukah timanya inun delol mispe behonu delol hisanos behon." This all is a quote from Megillas Tainis. Shekeshenichnasu Yavanim lahechal, when the Greeks entered into the inner precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, timu kolashmanim, they defiled all of the oil. Shebehechal ukishagavra malchus beis Chashmonai v'nitzkom, and when the kingdom of the Chashmonaim overcame them, it's interesting that the Rambam, that the Gemara characterizes Matisyahu and his children even then as Kishagavra Malchus Beis Chashmonai. The kingdom of, they weren't really kings at that time. And the Rambam, is very careful to say that in the aftermath, Hamidu Melech Minakohanim, B'chazar Malchus the Yisrael Yeser Al Masayim Shana Ad HaKor Ben Hasheni. The Gemara makes it seem that they had pronounced themselves or proclaimed themselves a Malchus earlier. Well, that's very interesting. I think has other ramifications, but not for now. Anyways, when that was successful, there was only, they found a single cruse of oil, which was sealed with the, special seal of the Kohen Gadol to establish its purity and the fact that no one had defiled it. And there was only enough oil for one day. The candle somehow lit, or the oil somehow lasted 8 days. We're all familiar. And in years to come, they established this as a permanent holiday of Yom Tov, of Hallel, and of Hoda'ah. A Yom Tov, we're familiar with the term, but Rashi says it doesn't mean Yom Tov in the typical ramifications. Normally, Yom Tov is a day in which it's prohibited to do malacha. Yom Tov is a day, which is very similar to Shabbos. The Yom Tov of Chanukah, as we know, is a secular day. It's a regular day of the week. So Rashi explains that the Yom Tov focused on the other two, on Hallel and on Hodah. It was a Yom Tov of saying Hallel and expressing Hodah. What is Hodah? Rashi says the saying of Alanisim in Berchas Hamazon and Tefillah, which we do to this very day. Alanisim, ala korkan, ala gvuras, ala chuos, ala bilchamos, shasis ala b'seinu bayamim ahim bazman hazeh, etc. So basically, when the Gemara asks the question, "My Chanukah," as we know, the Gemara is zeroing in on the nace of the Pach HaShemen, on the miracle of the candles and the candle lighting. And the military victory is basically the background story, but it is not the main event. And that is true not only in the Gemara, but also in the Rambam. I mentioned that the Rambam starts with history, a much more elaborate history than the Gemara, than this Brisa provides. But then he explains that's a transition, Ukishagavri Yisrael Aloiveim, when when Bnei Israel, when the children of Israel overcame their enemies, the Ibdum, and they destroyed them, the Chamisha Esrim B'chodesh Kislev, the 25th day of Kislev, Haya, that was the day. They entered into the Heichal, and they couldn't find, sufficient oil for the Mikdash, other than Ela Pach Echad. V'lo haya bo lahadlik eliyom echad bilvad, v'hidliku mimenu neris hamaracha shmona yamim ad shekatshu zesim v'hotziu shemen tahar. U'mipnei zeh, says the Rambam, Tkilu Chachamim Shaboso Ador Shishmonas Hayamim Ma'elu Shatkilasan Milel Chamisha V'Yesra B'Kislev from the 25th, from the night of the 25th, they should be Yemei Simcha. The Gemara calls it Yom Tov. The Rambam translated that. Unlike Rashi, who said that Yom Tov refers to the centrality of Hoda'ah and Hallel, Rambam says that the word Yom Tov means Yemei Simcha, days of joy. There's a big debate in the Rishonim already, whether there's a mitzvah of Seuda on Chanukah. Is it obligatory to have a festive meal on Chanukah? On Yom Tov, on Shabbos, Shabbos is Oneg Shabbos, Yom Tov, there's Simchas Yom Tov, we have festive meals. On Purim,
if you're mechuyev on Chanukah, would that be a nightly thing? Or when would you be mechuyev? Like twice a day? Like Yom Tov?
Not clear, but definitely at some time, at least during the day, at least once a day, there would be an obligation if there was an obligation. So again, Purim, we have Mishnah V'Simcha. Of course, there's a Suda. On Purim, we don't have an obligation twice. We have only once, right, during the day. So presumably it'd be something like that. Or, maybe every time you ate a meal, that would be considered a Sudas mitzvah, at least. So it's interesting. The Maram Rittenberg, who was the great Ashkenazic authority, he basically argued that there's no obligation of seuda on Chanukah. That there's he counseled that if you want to turn a Sudas Chanukah into a Sudas mitzvah, the way to do that would be through Divrei Torah, which is not a bad idea anyway. But all things being equal, there is no special obligation of having a festive Seuda on Chanukah. However, the Marshal, the 16th century, in his Yom Shel Shlomo, commenting on the Rambam's use of the word Yemei Simcha, which is the Rambam's translation of Yom Tov, unlike Rashi's, suggests that maybe the Rambam would be open to a festive meal being required every day, at least, of Chanukah. And if you wanted to do more than once a day, it would also be considered the fulfillment of a mitzvah. That was the view of the Yom Shel Shlomo. Famously, the Levush, also the 16th century, suggested, trying to explain the views that there is no obligation of Seuda on Chanukah, suggested that there's a fundamental difference between Chanukah and Purim. This became very famous because the contemporary, the Bach, picked up on it and quotes this Levush. And basically the idea is that Purim was about physical survival, meaning Haman through Achashverosh.
Well, that's why Chanukah Torah makes even more sense on Chanukah, right? Yeah. Based on that.
I agree. Yeah. Learning Torah, you mean?
Torah instead of the meal, yeah.
Yeah. So that's really what the Levush and the Bach tried to explain, that, Purim is about physical survival. And as such, eating and drinking, that's, a physical response to a physical threat. Whereas Chanukah was about, the effort of acculturation, of undermining the religious commitment and, the cultural uniqueness of the Jewish people. And therefore, the response is a more spiritual response of Hoda'ah and Hallel, of thanksgiving and of praise, which basically are intended to underscore what is unique about Jewish life and to appreciate, that what it is that differentiates us, even though oftentimes being differentiated can also be a source of pain, or at least of vulnerability, as we all know, as we have always known. But in recent days, that realization has become a little bit even more acute. And as such, um, that's the yesod, the principle of the levush and of the Bach, that this is a different focus, but maybe the Rambam disagrees. It's hard to know. In any case, the Rambam says Yimei Simcha v'Halel umadlikin mehenderos be'erev piskei abatim. That these days were established for Simcha, that's his rendition of Yom Tov, for Hallel, we'll discuss that in a minute, and for lighting of the candles. That's the Rambam's translation of the word Hodah, which is very significant. We've spoken about it in the past, but I'm going to refer to it again in just a few minutes, to make a point. It should be noted that in the Brisa, in Masachet Shabbos, it's interesting that the Chanukah is introduced with the articulation of Megillas Tainus, as I mentioned before, that work that collected like the special days of miracles and determined that there should be no fasting and no hespedim, no eulogies, on those particular days. But it's interesting to note that there is a debate among some of the poskim whether or not the prohibition of fasting and eulogizing on Chanukah is just the regular din of any joyous day of Megillas Tainus, or it has like a unique feature with respect to Chanukah, as well. So it's interesting to note on that regard, meaning, is there anything generic about the joy of Chanukah, or is it all, very specific? So it's interesting to note that the Gemara in Masachet Rosh Hashanah and Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis discusses in general whether or not the holidays of Megillas Tainus endured or not, or whether they were bata, they were canceled at a certain point. So, not sure if I have the right volume here. Nope, I do not. Just give me 1 second. Here we go. So the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah and Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis that there is a debate whether or not Megillas Tainus is something that endured or something that was canceled. Generally, our view is that it was canceled, but the Gemara says, Itmar Rebbe v'Rabbi Chanina, Omri, Betela Megillas Tainus. Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish Omri, Lo Betela Megillas Tainus. Question is whether the holidays of Megillas Tainus, based on the miracles that took place, in each case, was that something that was enduring and lasting or not? So the Gemara says, Rav Chanina Amri Betela Megillas Tainus. They said it was Batal, and then they bring proofs back and forth one way or another. So at one point, the Gemara wanted to bring a proof from Chanukah. Masav Rav Kahana, Ma'asav Agazur Tainus B'Chanukah, Belud. So there was a certain, they wanted to bring a proof for this question, whether or not Megillas Tainus is Batal. So they mentioned that there was in Lud, everybody's familiar with the city Lod, where Ben Gurion Airport, back in the day, I remember we used to say, instead of calling it Ben Gurion Airport, it used to be called Lod because that's the city where it's found. Anyways, so they made a tainus, they decreed a fast day on Chanukah in the city of Lod, or Lod. So, but the Gemara says that the reaction to that takana was the Yarad Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar went down. He was very upset that they, decreed a fast day on Chanukah. The Rachatz, and he publicly bathed in order to show that he does not accept the idea that there can be a fast day, that there can be a fast on Chanukah. Rabbi Yeshua went down Vesiper, and he took a haircut to show that he also is not treating this as a tainus, meaning that it's an affront to the joy of Chanukah, to fast on Chanukah. For Amr Lahem, and he said, Su'u v'hit'anu al mashes na'isem. He said, those of you who have been fasting on Chanukah should fast another day of the year to be mechaper, to get atonement for fasting on Chanukah because it's so inappropriate. So we see from there the Gemara says that lo batla Megillas Tainus, because they tried to impose this fast, and the Chachamim were very upset with them. Obviously, they felt that the din of Megillas Tainus, that there's no Tainus and there's no Hesped, is something that continues to be true. So the Gemara says, very interestingly, Amar Rav Yosef, Shiny Chanukah, the Ika mitzvah. That Chanukah is different. Maybe all of Megillas Tainus was batel, but shiny Chanukah is different. It's unique because there is not only a prohibition against fasting and eulogizing, but there's also a mitzvah, meaning the mitzvah of Neros Chanukah. That's what distinguishes this holiday. We'll get back to what that means a little bit later on. But then the Gemara says, the Gemara originally thought it was a technicality. The Gemara was thinking, well, because it's a mitzvah, so they couldn't cancel Chanukah as easily as they canceled the other days of Megillas Tainus. So the Gemara says, all right, so let them cancel only mitzvah d'Rabbanan, let them cancel the mitzvah, too. So the Gemara says, Amalei Abaya v'tibatel ihu, v'tibatel mitzvasa. If they let them cancel the day and cancel the mitzvah. Elam Rav Yosef, shiny Chanukah de mefarsem Nisan. Apparently, the Pirsum Anes and everything that goes along with it, the publicizing of the remarkable events of Chanukah is so significant that it defies the fate of the rest of Megillas Tainus. Not that they couldn't cancel the mitzvah, but they wouldn't, because there's something timeless, you might say, about the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah and the Pirsum Anes, that is a result of it. So it's an interesting thing. There are different ways to understand the Gemara, but the takeaway is that the Gemara in Shabbos introduces Chanukah by noting the background of Megillas Tainus, and then the Gemara has a discussion in Rosh Hashanah whether or not Megillas Tainus is batel or not. And initially, they want to bring a proof from the fact that Chanukah is not batel, implying that at least when it comes to Tainus and Hesped, that Tainus, that Megillah is like that. Sorry, that Chanukah is like any other holiday of Megillas Tainus. The question is how to evaluate the maskana of the Gemara. When the Gemara says, even if the other holidays of Megillas Tainus were batel, there's something timeless and enduring about Chanukah. It's not negotiable. Chanukah became a part of the, fundamental or core identity of Jewish observance and the identity of the Jewish people. And why is that? Because it's connected to a mitzvah and to Pirsum Hanes. And we really need to understand what that is. Is the Gemara telling us that even the Tainus and the Hesped are different, or that there really are two aspects to Chanukah? There's part of Megillas Tainus, and independently, there's a special status of Chanukah itself. Hard to know. It's interesting that the Lavush, who I mentioned before, in Siman Tafresh Ayin, in the beginning of his treatment of Hilchos Chanukah, says that the prohibition to have a misped, to have a hesped, a eulogy on Chanukah, is also connected very specifically with the spiritual danger and therefore the spiritual response that is embodied, in the observance of Chanukah. We said before, the Lavush and the Bach were the ones who highlighted the fact that there's a fundamental difference between Purim and Chanukah. That one is about physical survival, and the other is about, spiritual, the danger of spiritual, extinction. So it's interesting.
Isn't there also something? Sorry to interrupt, but is it on Purim like working is like Hanukkah? No one says it's forbidden to work, but I think Purim. Isn't there something about?
No, even on Hanukkah, there are those who think that maybe while you're lighting the neighbors Hanukkah, people shouldn't work.
That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, right. Purim had more, seemed to have had much more of a possibility of becoming like a Yom Tov than Chanukah. And if you look in the Megillah, maybe we'll discuss this when we get to Purim, but if you look at the Megillah, originally talked about this in the past, that the Megillah originally formulates the days of Purim as a Yom Tov. They call it, Yom Tov, and they mention Mishloach Manos, and they also mention, Simcha Umishta. So originally it was called a Yom Tov.
Well,
When you look at the end of the Megillah, since you're asking, in the final iteration or description of Purim, the Megillah drops the word Yom Tov and adds instead Matanos Le'Evyonim and flips the relationship between Simcha and Mishta. In other words, originally it said that it's a day of Yom Tov, of Simcha Umishta Umatanos Le'Evyonim, and then later it said it's a day of Mishta v'Simcha, flip that order, right? And Matanos and Mishloach Manos and Matanos Le'Evyonim. So the Gemara already noted part of it. The Gemara says, how come originally Purim was called a Yom Tov? And then later Purim was kind of rebranded without the Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, enough Gemina is, originally they thought they were going to make it a Yom Tov and there would be Isur Malacha, like you wouldn't be able to plant. The Gemara has a whole discussion. The certain Amoraim used to plant, things in their garden on Purim. So the Gemara said, how could you do that? It's Purim. So the Gemara says, no, you don't understand. Originally, they were thinking that Purim would be a Yom Tov, but in the final iteration, they dropped the Yom Tov, so there is no Isur Malacha. So I also think that the switch in order between Mishta and Simcha Mishta and the addition of Matanos Le'Evyonim is important as well. So all this was the secularization. I don't mean it in the way that it sounds, meaning not making it a Yom Kodesh like Shabbos and Yom Tov, but making it a Yom Chol that zeroes in on Hashgacha and so on. And talk about Purim now.
What's Purim going to be eventually? Isn't Purim going to be? What's Purim after Moshe Mashiach? Does it become a what?
The only what the Talmud Yerushalmi said that the Rambam also quotes, and the last halacha of Hilchos Megillah, is that in the future, when other Sfarim will be B'Telim, and there's a parallel medrash that says it's about other holidays will be B'Telim, that because of the pasuk in the end of the Megillah, that the Megillah and the holiday of Purim will not vanish, will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. It will be observed under all circumstances. But
and Chanukah also? Chanukah also?
No, doesn't say that. But there's no indication that Purim is ever going to be a Yom Tov. My view of Purim is that it's good the way it is. Meaning it wasn't not made a Yom Tov because they felt that Klal Yisrael couldn't handle it. It was intentionally not made into a Yom Tov because it reflects a certain, capacity, even on Yom Chol, to appreciate, the what looks like natural, but against the background of history and coincidences, is anything but. I mean, the principle. I don't want to talk too much about Purim right now, but the theme in Purim is v'nafochu. It's the idea of, Balaylahu nadash nas hamelech. The coincidences, everything happening, at the right time. So that's one way in which the Ribono Shel Olam, visits his hashgacha on the Jewish people. It all may look very natural, but the timing and the background, and once you see the bigger picture, it's impossible not to see Purim, as an unbelievable testament to Hashgachas Hashem, to divine providence, in the sense that, again, that's why we say the Megillah is an Igeris and a Sefer. Igeris meaning like a scroll, a letter. You're supposed to keep the Gaonim said you should keep it open all the way the whole time. The idea being that, you're looking at the big picture always, the coincidences, the juxtapositions. So making it into a Yom Chol wasn't because they couldn't make it into a Shabbos or Yom Tov. It's because it's a different kind of celebration. It's a celebration of the quiet, but undeniable providence of Hashem. And I think that's why there's also a drinking element, not too much, mind you. People should be careful about it. But they switched Simcha Mishta to Mishta and Simcha because the idea is that when it comes to Yom Tov, you're supposed to eat a festive meal as a result of being sameach with the Simchas Yom Tov of Talmud Torah and davening, and whatever the Yom Tov is, Chag HaMatzos, Chag HaShavuos, Chag HaSukkos, etc. So you're in a joyous mood, and that reflects itself also in a Seudah. However, on Purim, that was the original idea when it was going to be a Yom Tov for the Isur Malacha. But then when they flipped it, what they were saying was, we want this to be a Yom Chol that is suffused with an appreciation for divine providence. And part of the way to do that is also that instead of the Simcha triggering the Mishta should trigger the Simcha, which is why, there's a history of, encouraging, some alcoholic consumption on Purim, not on Chanukah, on Purim, within reason. The Rambam says a little more than usual, and so on. But I think the idea is to kind of stimulate a consciousness or a kind
Well,
of
there's Adelo Yada also, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what is Adelo Yada?
You can do it. You can go to sleep also, right?
The Rambam says that you should, drink until you fall asleep. But as the Mepharshim point out, the goal isn't to fall asleep. You should drink, and they should drink a little more, but you shouldn't drink where you're oblivious and can't appreciate the goal of the day. You should drink a little bit to kind of raise your, level of awareness to something which isn't fully maybe articulatable, but is something that you feel maybe that when people are a little bit looser, with their emotions. But I think, in my opinion, again, I don't want to speak too much more about Purim. I want to contrast it, but the calibrating, how to do that on Purim is very much an art form. Mostly, you run into a lot of people on Purim who don't understand what the holiday is really all about. It's not an excuse to, lose control over your, discipline and emotions. It's a time to be a little bit more open or a little bit more, flexible, and to let yourself maybe experience or feel things within reason, that lend greater appreciation, to the implications of the day. Rav Amram Gaon used to say Tachanun on Purim. That sounds very peculiar to us. We don't say Tachanun.
Well, it's also a day for tefillah, right? Purim is also that's not so crazy. Oh, Tachanun, you're saying not for tefillah, but for sadness.
No, Tachanun and tefillah. And normally on a happy, joyous day, like on Hanukkah, you don't say Tachanun. We Paskin, you don't say Tachanun on Purim. Tachanun is a more somber. It is like it's
or you don't say it on Yontif. It contradicts Yontif part.
Yeah,
you wouldn't say Tachanun on Yontif.
According to Rav Amram, you have to understand, Rav Amram was an early architect of the Siddur. It's like the earliest work that we have in the Gaonic work, post Talmud. He had putting together the Siddur. And therefore he's a big authority in the Siddur. We don't follow him in this, but even though we don't follow him, there's something to what he's saying, and that is that there's a somber aspect to Purim. It's a joyous day, but it's joyous because we appreciate the divine providence, that and what seem to be coincidences, that converge, to create that joy. So Purim and Chanukah are very much related. I mean, the Rambam treats Purim and Chanukah, in one section, and of course,
you say Al Anisim on
the
both.
obligation of Neros Chanukah. The Rambam actually, makes reference, to Purim as well. In fact, the Rambam says, "Kol shechayev." The next halakha on the Rambam, halakha Daled, is that it begins halakas Neros mitzvah midivrei sofrim kikriyas hamegillah. Kol shechayev b'kriyas Megillah chayev b'hadlakas ner Chanukah, and so on. So the Rambam is very constantly reminding us what we know anyway, but that he emphasizes even further, and that is the comparison to between Megillah and Neros Chanukah, between the holiday of Purim and the holiday of Chanukah, but also some of the differences that emerge. So in terms of the differences, that's what I was trying to note with the Levush and the Bach. So while Purim is very focused on the physicality of the day, because it's all about, a story of existential, threat and survival, but in a way that is built on, what we call Nes Nistar, hidden miracles that are just so apparent when you look at the pattern, of events and the divine providence that they imply. But Hanukkah, as we were arguing, there's no mishta v'simcha. There's not, even mishta, and only the Rambam says really that there's simcha, there's hodah, and there's hal. It's a much more intellectual, um, intellectually oriented, celebration. It revolves. You don't say Hallel at all on Purim. The Kriyas
Some say the Megillah is the hollow, right? Megillah
yeah,
is the
but even though there's a view again. I don't want to speak too much about Purim, but the Meiri has a comment where he says, "Well, let's say you don't have a Megillah and you're not reading Megillah on Purim. So should you say Hallel? Because we say Kriyasa Zu Hilela. So it sounds like it's a substitute. So if you don't have the substitute, you should say the real thing." That is a view in the Meiri, but it's not the consensus view among Baalei Halacha. Because what they understand is that what the Gemara meant was something more profound. The Gemara didn't just mean that the Megillah is a replacement or a substitute for Hallel, and therefore, if you don't have it, you should go back to the original. What they meant was what Hallel is to a regular Yom Tov and to Hanukkah, that's what the Megillah is to Purim. Meaning, we calibrated, the halacha calibrated exactly, how to underscore the similarities, but all the differences between two holidays that are very closely connected. So in Purim, we don't say Hallel. Hallel is very explicit. It's very, it's very much articulated. The Megillah is a story of coincidences. It's v'nafochu. It's balaylahu nodosh nasamelech. It's, umiodea im la'es kazos, he got lemalchus. It's it's an igeris. You keep the whole thing open. Ein medaktikin, I think I spoke about this last Purim. Ein medaktikin bikriyasa. You don't have to worry if you pronounce the words exactly correct. You should try. I know the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, has a reputation for. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but for
only
excellent.
because we have the top person that reads the Megillah.
That's what I'm saying. An excellent Kriyas HaMegillah. I'm told by a perennial member of our Shiur. So the idea of ein medaktikin, be osio sehar bekriyasa, seems very fortunate, and of course the preference is to, like any kriya, because it's also kriya b'kisvei kodesh, is to be as medayik as you can, and the Megillah really comes alive when the trup is right, and and it's again, the tradition in where I live also is for many years we had a wonderful Baal Kore for the Kriyas HaMegillah, who's the last few years he passed away about 4 or 5 years ago, but who had an unforgettable Kriyas HaMegillah because it was not only precise, but it was also even the tone of it, I wouldn't say it was acted out exactly, but it came alive, through its precision and its accuracy. However, the halacha itself says ein medaktikin b'kriyasa, because the bigger idea in the Kriyas Megillah, it's true when you have both, when you have the trup done properly and all the letters pronounced carefully, that's certainly an added dimension. But even before you get to that, just the raw pieces of the story are undeniable expressions of hashgacha. So Purim is a looser holiday. in that respect. Chanukah, as I say, because it's focused so much on what it is that we were struggling for. It wasn't physical survival. It was our spiritual uniqueness, distinctiveness, identity. And as I say, then that's a question, is there a Suda even or is there not? You went from the Mishtava Simcha of Purim to not even having a Suda, or maybe having a Suda according to the Rambam, in on Hanukkah. And as you say, maybe dotted with Divrei Torah to turn it into a Simcha, a Suda Shel Mitzvah. But especially instead of Kriyas HaMegillah, which is this looser, it's the story itself. On Hanukkah, it's Hallel. These are the days of Hallel. Ad Kedei Kach that Hallel is a concept that we're all familiar with. Many people, when they think of Hallel, they think mostly of Yom Tov. They don't think necessarily of Hanukkah. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, the Rambam could have developed the dinim of Hallel in Hilchos Yom Tov, in the Rambam's scheme of things, in Sefer Zmanim, which deals with the holidays, begins with Shabbos, and then from there it goes to Eruvin, and then to Yom Kippur, Shvisas Asar, and then comes Hilchos Yom Tov, about Yom Tovim in general, and then it breaks down into Hilchos Chametz Umatzah, Hilchos Shofar, Sukkah, Lulav, et cetera, et cetera. And then, towards the end, you get Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah, and Tainus, et cetera. So in the order of the Rambam, where would we have expected to find the dinam of Hallel? Well, the first and the earliest opportunity and the most obvious opportune place for that to be developed would be in Hilchos Yom Tov, right? Most of the times that we say Hallel are in the Yom Tovim. And Hilchos Yom Tov, as I say, is in the early part of Sefer Zmanim. So it's fascinating that the Rambam held out the dinim of Hallel until Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. Why did he do
where should it be? I'm sorry?
In Hilchos Yom Tov.
But it's not Yom Tov, we said.
Hallel.
Hallel comes. I'm sorry. Hallel comes in.
The dinim of Hallel
are learned there. I got it.
Are discussed in Hilchos Chanukah.
I got it.
And where are they discussed in Hilchos Chanukah? It's fascinating to note. I'll tell you exactly where. In Perek Gimel of Hilchos Chanukah, beginning with Halacha Hey. Why is that particularly interesting? It's something I've spoken about in the past, but a different point to be made of it. As I say, the Rambam begins Hilchos Chanukah in Perek Gimel, third chapter, meaning the first two chapters are Hilchos Megillah, and I'm trying to build this contrast, and then comes Hilchos Chanukah. So that begins the third, what's called Perek Gimel. Hilchos Chanukah is really the first chapter of Hilchos Chanukah. It's the third chapter of the joint, big chapter of Megillah and Chanukah. So it's chapter 3. So the Ram begins the third chapter with history. I already read that, and then he talks about the obligation to light the candles. And who is obligated, and then he describes the brachos that you make when you light the candles. Right? Whoever is obligated to read the Megillah. It's interesting how the Rambam keeps contrasting and comparing to Megillah. It's obligated in their Chanukah as well. On the first night, he makes 3 brachos, and they are, right? Asher Kedesham Tos Mitzvah Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. Sha'asa Nisam Lavosenu, Bayimim Ahim Bazman Hazeh, and Shechiyanu Vikimanu Vigiyanu Lazman Hazeh. We're all familiar. That's what we do. And the other nights, says the Rambam, if he only sees it and he doesn't light, he only makes on the first night the Birchas Haroah, Sha'asa Nisam and Shechiyanu, Sha'asa Nisam V'Shechiyanu, Ubishar Haleilos Madlik Umavorek Shtayim. And as we know, you say Shechian only the first night. So the other nights you would say only the other two brachos. So the Rambam begins with history. He transitions into the lighting of the Neiros and the brachos that you make on the Neiros. What should be the next halacha? This is already halacha. What should be the next halacha on the Rambam?
Rabbi Roth, you're not on mute.
What
We can hear you.
Yeah. What should be halacha hey? What should be the next halacha in the Rambam? So one would have
Not sure.
expected that the next halacha would be the hadlaka, the lighting of the candles, because you just talked about the bracha. We say
Right.
there's an obligation to light candles. Here are the brachos. How many brachos to make the first day? How many brachos to make the next day? What if you only see and you don't light? How do you do the brachos? What's the next halacha on the Rambam? What should it be? The lighting.
Lighting.
Then instead, what you have is from halacha hey through the end of the parak, that's 10 halachos, from number 5 to 14, are all dinim of halal. And then at the beginning of the 4th chapter, the Rambam says, Kama neirus umadlik b'Chanukah. Meaning what the Rambam did, let me tell you what halacha hey is. B'kol yom v'yom mishmonas hayamim ha'elu, in every one of these days, gomrim es ha'halel. We're supposed to say halel. Umevarach lefanav baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu ligmor es ha'halel bein b'yachid bein b'tzibur. And the bracha that you make on Hallel, and the next 10 halachos in the Rambam are about Hallel. So what the Rambam did was quite remarkable. What did he do? And remember, we're talking about the Rambam, right? The Rambam deserves, and this is an understatement, he deserves the award for being the greatest systematizer of Jewish law, of all time. Many people have written on Jewish law. No one was more systematic, organized, creative in his organization than the Rambam. Right, Rabbi Roth, you're in agreement?
Absolutely.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. It's even though Rabbi Roth and I can disagree, but we can't disagree about this because it's like it's close to being a fact.
We disagree occasionally.
Occasionally, but this is almost in the category of a fact. You can't disagree about this. So the Rambam, the greatest systematizer of Jewish law of all time, most creative systematizer, the most organized. Look what he did here. He had an earlier prominent showcase for the Dinam of Hallel in Hilchos Yom Tov. Right? There are many more Yom Tov. The Chanukah is one holiday, and it's a holiday d'Rabbanan. Right? He divrei sofrim. The other holidays, we're talking about saying Hallel on the it's Hallel Doraisa, let's say, or full Hallel on the first day of Chag HaMatzos, on Chag HaShavuos, every single day of Chag HaSukkos, right? You don't say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because there you may Yirav Afachad, so we understand. But in all Yomim Tovim, and the Rambam, or he could have put it in Hilchos Chametz Matzah or Hilchos Sukkah. He ignored those earlier showcases, right? And instead, he held out until practically the end of Sefer Zmanim, and he put it in Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. Number one. Number two, if he's already going to put it here, there are three other points to be made. Right? One is, where did he put it? Right smack in the middle between his discussion of Birchas Chanukah, Birchas Neiros Chanukah, right? And the next chapter, which begins anew about Neiros Chanukah, the lighting of the Neiros. As you know, by the way, when I talk about the lighting of the Neiros, it's not so simple either. The Rambam has his own views on that as well. As we know, we'll talk a little bit more. There are three levels of lighting. We're all familiar. Ner Ishubeso, lighting one candle for the entire household, or Mahadrin, that's questionable what that is, or Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin. Most of us, at least Ashkenazim, we follow the view of the Ramah we mostly do Mahadran Min Mahadran, meaning we light one menorah for each individual according to the number of days of Chanukah. Right, tonight was the sixth night of Chanukah, so every individual lights six. That's Mahadran, Min Mahadran. So the Ram he speaks about the brachos, right, and then he interrupts 10 halachos for Hallel. Isn't that peculiar? A hefsek between the bracha and the lighting, literally, and then he gets back to in a new chapter. He forgets about Chanukah. He doesn't really. I'm not being serious. He doesn't really forget about Chanukah, but he interrupts between after mentioning the bracha on the Neiros Chanukah. He doesn't continue that discussion until chapter 4. Instead, he has 10 halachos dedicated to Hallel. Wow, that's very extraordinary. Not only that, the Rambam in the beginning of every big section always introduces the section by identifying the mitzvos in that section. For example, in Hilchos Shabbos, he'll tell you there's a mitzvah to make kiddush, there's a mitzvah, of Zohar, there's a prohibition of Isur Malacha, there's an obligation to rest, Shvisa. He always lists the mitzvos. And when it comes to Hilchos Megillah and Chanukah, it's very fascinating to note that the Rambam is talking about mitzvos d'Rabbanan, mitzvos midivrei sofrim. He says, Yesh b'chlalan, this is the beginning of Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah, shtei mitzvos aseh, midivrei sofrim, ve'ena min minyan. They're not counted in the minyan of Taryag of 613 mitzvos because they're only rabbinic in obligation. But what are the two mitzvos that the Rambam speaks of in Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah according to his own account? The mitzvah of Megillah and the mitzvah of Neiros Chanukah. But he spends 10 halachos, which could have been put earlier in Hilchos Chanukah, interrupting between the lighting of the Neiros, the brachos on the Neiros, and the actual lighting of the Neiros, and speaks about most extensively in all of Yad Chazaka, the dinim of Hallel. So what was the Rambam trying to tell us with this very unusual choice of presentation, right? Even problematic choices, very counterintuitive and very, atypical of the Rambam's, usual, incredible facility, when it comes to organization and systemization. And just one more, just to highlight it further, and that is that the Rambam here, basically invokes the Gemara in Masachet Shabbos. The Gemara in Masachet Shabbos asks the question on Daf Chav Gimel. The Gemara says, "How can you ever say the word v'tzivanu when you're making a bracha on a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, on a rabbinic mitzvah?" The word v'tzivanu says, "Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam," the psicha of a typical birchas mitzvah, "Asher kiddeshanu," right, b'mitzvotav, who made us holy with his or through his commandments, vitzivanu, and commanded us. And then what do we say? L'tkoa b'shofar, or al tkiya shofar, l'shmoa es shofar, litol lulav, right? Al netilas lulav, right? That's a typical birchas mitzvah. What do you say in Chanukah? Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. So the Gemara says, how can you say v'tzivanu? How can you say that Hashem, that God commanded us? It's a rabbinic obligation. It didn't come from the Torah. So this is a famous Gemara. Gemara says that there is v'tzivanu anyway. You can say he commanded us because he commanded us to follow the Chachamim. The Torah says, lo sasur, you're not supposed to veer yaminu small, right or left. You're not supposed to diverge from the obligations that the Torah defines. One of those obligations is to listen to the Chachamim. So since you're supposed to listen to the Chachamim, you can say Vitzivanu. All that is good. Why am I telling you all this? The Gemara says this about Ner Chanukah. When the Rambam writes this halacha, he writes it in connection not with Ner Chanukah, but with Hallel. The Rambam says, one second. The Kol Yom V'Yom Mishmonas Hayamim Ha'elu, in each of these 8 days, Gomrin es Hallel, we complete the Hallel. Umavarich lefana barachat Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu v'mitzvosav v'tzivanu ligmar es Hallel bein yachid bein tzibur. Right, whether you read it in a minyan or individually. And then he says, Afal pisha kriyas Hallel mitzvah midivrei sofrim, even though the reading of Hallel, the reciting of Hallel, is only a rabbinic obligation. Nonetheless, Mavarech Allah Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, you can still say that God has sanctified us and commanded us kederach shemavarech ala Megillah v'ala eruv shekol vaday shel divrei mavarchen alav, etc. So the Rambam basically zeroes in on this idea that you can say v'tzivanu on a rabbinic obligation, which the Gemara attributes or the Gemara associates with the Neros Chanukah. The Rambam, when he quotes this or invokes this halacha, he does so with regard to Hallel. So what is the upshot of all of this? Why does the Rambam treat Hallel as if, it is a part of Neros Chanukah? Right in the middle of Neros Chanukah, in Hilchos Chanukah, doesn't give it credit as a separate mitzvah, only Neros Chanukah and Megillah. What the Gemara says, B'tzivanu, about Neros Chanukah, the Rambam says about Hallel. Like, why is that? The answer is, because that's exactly what the Gemara said. The Gemara said, my Chanukah, what is the essential character of Chanukah? And the Gemara explains that they're days of Yom Tov, Hallel, and Hodah. So the Rambam's interpretation of Yom Tov, Hallel, and Hodah is that Yom Tov is Simcha. That's what he means. That's what he says. Hallel means Hallel, and Hodah is a reference, says the Rambam, Bahadlakas Neros. One second. As the Rambam says it, use the exact language. Umadlikin Bahana Neros Ba'erev al Piskei Habatim B'Chalayla B'Layla. So it seems like the Rambam thinks that the physical act of lighting the menorah is almost like the equivalent to the articulation of Hallel and Hoda'ah, which comes on the heels of Hallel. In other words, more than any other holiday, the holiday of Chanukah, although it is B'divrei Sofer, although it's only a rabbinic holiday, but the principle of Hallel, right, is actually more acutely applicable, relevant on Chanukah, even than it is on a Yom Tov. That's what it would appear according to the Rambam. And therefore the Rambam passed up the opportunity to insert it in Hilchos Yom Tov, decided, right, that it was two sides of the same coin with the mitzvah of Hadlakas Neros Chanukah, and therefore didn't consider it to be an interruption when he interposed it between his treatment of the bracha on the Neros and the actual lighting of the candles, which is quite remarkable. And therefore, when the Gemara said that, you could say Vitzivanu on Neros Chanukah, the Rambam felt comfortable saying you could say Vitzivanu on the bracha of Hallel. The Chassam Sofer was of the opinion that the only Hallel that is really Doraisa is the Hallel of Chanukah. And the reason for that is, the Gemara says in Masachet Psachim, Adaf Kuf Yud Zayin, that we say Hallel al kol perek uperek al kol tzara v'tzara. That we say Hallel to mark like a significant milestone in the calendar, like a Yom Tov, al kol perek uperek. But we also say it al kol tzara v'tzara, on any time of crisis. And a time of crisis is a time, or a time in the aftermath of a crisis, of saying Hallel. And the Rashi and the Rashbam in Masachet Psachim say that Al Kol Tzara V'Tzara is epitomized by Chanukah. So what emerges is a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that while there is a parallel between Megillah and Chanukah, they're even put in the same section. The Rambam keeps making reference to whoever's obligated in one is obligated in the other, and so on and so forth. There are subtle differences between the two that become even more pronounced because of the comparisons. The comparisons would lead us to think that they would be practically identical, and therefore the small differences really stand out and characterize, two very distinctive holidays. Purim is Pirsa Manes, and it is a way of kind of, experiencing in a physical way, right, the hashgacha of the Ribono Shel Olam. And as such, there's no Hallel, there's Kriyas HaMegillah, which, as we noted, is all about those coincidences and the bigger picture, and so on. But Hanukkah is really about surviving maybe a worse tzara, because while physical destruction obviously is very harsh, what's unique about the Jewish people in the end is their culture, their values, their commitment to the Ribono Shel Olam. And Hanukkah is an Eis Tzara in which that really, was tested in its own right. And that's why the Rambam begins Hilchos Hanukkah, Perek Gimel, by noting that the larger climate was basically to deny Klal Yisrael the opportunity, right, to perform mitzvos. On the surface, that doesn't seem, like a bigger crisis, than physical survival of the holiday of Purim. How could it even, compete, frankly, with Purim? But on another level, the crisis is more severe because it's more subtle. Meaning, at a time of Shas HaGzeira, where you're living in a situation where another government is imposing its culture upon you and not allowing the free expression of Avodas Hashem, so you could, think that, the principle of Pikuach Nefesh, of, safeguarding, your life, that would be something that would take priority over, anything else. After all, the Chai Bohem Velo Sheyamas Bahem, mostly when a person has to choose between the performance of a mitzvah and the possibility of a loss of life, aside from the circumstances of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Damim, the three cardinal Averos, or Bepirsum, this is a public challenge. The clear decision in the halacha is that the sanctity of life and preservation of life is something that wins out. And as such, one could have thought that there was no need for the radical military response, which jeopardized all of Eretz Yisrael, Jews, at that time. Just go along with the Gzeros, for a time. However, there is a third category of Mesiras Nefesh, and that is exactly this idea of Shas HaGzeira or Shas HaShmad. And that's what the Rambam refers to when he says, Ubitlu datam velo hinicham osam lasok b'Torah b'mitzvos. And it's fascinating because there is a source which establishes that the three Averos, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, Rotzeach, murder, idolatry, adultery, we'll call it, these have a source that establish that you're supposed to give up your life rather than violate. There's a source that tells you that if you're challenged publicly in terms of your commitment, Kiddush Hashem Barabim, that you're supposed to give up your life. But there is no source in the Talmud that supports the conclusion, which is uniformly accepted, that in a Shas Hashmad, that in a time of religious crisis, that you're supposed to give up your life. That is just assumed to be the case without the need to source it at all. And that is very telling, obviously. It's almost as if what we're, the lesson is that a life of spiritual mediocrity, a life, in which, the enemy whittles away, your commitment just a little bit every single day, but you don't have the opportunity to pursue spiritual excellence. You don't have this opportunity to live a life of spirituality at all. That in some level, that is no life at all. And on some level, that is even, less significant, than that is then sorry, that is an even greater danger to Klal Yisrael, certainly to the legacy of Klal Yisrael, than the loss of life itself. And for that reason, the focus is on spiritual survival and spiritual manifestations that express our devotion to a maximalist Jewish life. So that even though the milchama, the war, which obviously needed to be won, is so critical and is something that we celebrate, the predominant expression of our joy and our celebration revolves around the Pach Hashem. And I think precisely because it is the symbol of not giving in, not surrendering to the tyranny of, a slow, torturous spiritual extinction. What the Neitz Pach Hashem really demonstrated was that the Ribono Shel Olam would create a miracle to allow for a maximal hadlakas neiros b'mikdash in the aftermath of the victory of the Chashmonaim, as if to declare that the purpose of the war and the goal of the war, namely to revive, a maximalist spiritual life of the Jewish people, to allow the Jewish people to express themselves, in a distinctive Torah way, that was a battle worth fighting, and that the victory, which would usher in, a different kind of an age, was something to celebrate. And that's very different than Purim. That's very different than physical survival. Both obviously are critical. That's why there's Hilchos Megillah and Chanukah. That's why there's so much overlap. Kol HaChayev b'Mikra Megillah, Chayev b'Neiros Chanukah. However, that expresses itself in very different ways. Purim in a physical experience of joy and of hashgacha, and on Chanukah, Limud Torah, a focus on tahara, purity, and reveling in the nace of the Pach Hashem. And therefore, going back to what we began with, it's interesting. I mentioned that the Lavush says that the prohibition to have eulogies on Chanukah, in addition to being a function of Megillah's kindness, which it is also an expression of this spiritual focus of Hanukkah, this idea that Hanukkah came about because Jewish people, were negligent in some respects, and then they became, the victims of religious persecution. They were initially, insufficiently appreciative of their opportunities to live in a maximalist life of Avodas Hashem. Then that was taken away from them. And then they fought, with grit and determination, relentlessly against all odds in order to, restore, that potential, not just to live, but to live, a meaningful Torah life. And therefore, the focus of Hanukkah is on the Nes Pach Shemen and on Limud Torah and on Hallel and on Hoda'ah, expressions of an appreciation for having a spiritual agenda. So the Netziv said, the Lavush says that even the mispaid, which is part of every Megillah's Tainus, takes on or assumes, new proportions. meaning it's not just, that it's a happy or joyous day, and therefore the, depressing fallout of a eulogy. A eulogy is supposed to make you cry. A eulogy, accentuates a kriya she'ena misacha, an irreplaceable, irrevocable loss. Obviously, mispaid is inconsistent with a Yom Simcha. But the Lavush suggests that it's more than that. He says a mispaid, a eulogy can also deflect from the total focus, that is required in the sense of surrender to Avodas Hashem. Because Avel, mourning, is a kind of paralysis. That's why there's no Torah study in the period of mourning. It's a bubble in time. It's an opportunity psychologically and halachically for one to, just be kind of caught in the moment of that loss, to absorb it fully, and to try to imagine, how to continue one's life, how to move forward in the aftermath of a loss. And therefore, a hesped is inappropriate, not only in a day of joy, but it's even more inappropriate in a day which is all about reveling in great appreciation through Hallel and Hodah, the spiritual opportunities of a meaningful life. And indeed, the exception to a mispaid, to a hesped being prohibited on Chanukah is the hesped of a Talmud Chacham. If it's a Talmud Chacham, you can have a hesped even on Chanukah. So what is that, favoritism? The Chachamim, are trying to, chas v'shalom, that isn't the point. They weren't trying to feather their own hesped nest. But what it is a recognition that the hesped of a Talmud Chacham is something a little bit different, because it focuses on the life of a living Sefer Torah and the values of Torah itself. So rather than being, a source of paralysis, the hesped of a Talmud Chacham is really supposed to be like a teaching moment or a learning moment, and then a moment to appreciate, greatness. And on the contrary, the hesped of a Talmud Chacham is supposed to be really a source of, perpetuating, his legacy, almost like a, dmus diukno shel Abba. The Torah says, and Rashi brings the Medrash in this week's Parsha, that, that Yosef, at a critical moment in his life, when he was tempted, to behave in an immoral way, so by Yismaimeah, he hesitated, and the dmus diukno of his father, the image of Yaakov Avinu, was a source of strength, to him. I commemorated a yahrzeit last night, and today for my mother. And all of us feel this way, about those who have departed and who meant so much in our lives. The idea of a living presence, of a dmus diukno, shel Abba or shel Ima or shel Rebbe. The idea that the impact that great people, influential people in your lives had on you, continue to converse with them, in a certain way, and to wonder what they would think or say, or to know what they would think and say, etc. So the hesped of a Talmud Chacham is not something that contradicts what the Levush calls the hachna'ah and the avoda, or the commitment to avodas Hashem. On the contrary, it is what perpetuates. You bring out, the unique or singular contribution of the great man of Torah. You're basically inspiring people, to uncover facets of of Torah life, that maybe will inspire them, going forward. So it's interesting to note that he doesn't say the same thing about the Tainus, the Lavush. That he leaves as Megillah's Tainus. And the Gaon of Vilna, of this I'll conclude, in the Gemara, when the Gemara says about Chanukah that there are 8 days to lo lispod bahon velo lis ana bahon, it's interesting that the Vilna Gaon struck out the word lemisped bahon. Everybody wonders why. It's very mysterious. In Megillah's Tainus, it says these are days where there's no eulogies and there's no fasting. And it comes from Megillah's Tainus. Why did he take out the eulogy part and leave in the fasting part. But according to the Lavush, I would say that the reason is because the fasting part is just the usual din of Megillas Tainus, but the eulogy part has a unique feature of Chanukah, and the reason is for the exact reason that the Lavush explains and the Bach explains, namely the fasting part, is connected, to food, and that's kind of that's the emphasis on Purim. But Hanukkah is a time of deep appreciation for the cultural uniqueness, the spiritual uniqueness of the Jewish people, a time to say Hallel, a time to glory in the Nes Pach Hashem and what it revealed about the motivation and the impact and success of the Milchama. That is, again, spiritually focused. It really zeroes in on what is unique about the legacy of the Jewish people and their destiny, not just to survive, but to live a certain kind of life, a life of very special values and devotion to each other, and to the Ribono Shel Olam. That was really what was at stake, and therefore maybe the Gaon of Vilna took that out because that's not the Misped Bahon isn't only the regular Megillas Tainus. It also is connected to to the unique feature of Hanukkah itself. And maybe that's also why that even though the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara seems to treat Hanukkah, at least initially, like any other Megillas Tainus. It's strange. It seems obvious that Hanukkah, is more enduring. It has mitzvos, it has Pirsumei Nisa. So, but maybe when it comes to fasting and eating, that's not where it expresses itself. But the extra mitzvah of Pach Shemen and the fact that it is mefarsim as a mitzvah, that's where Hanukkah is really singular and unique. So I just want to conclude by saying that obviously everything right now is so colored by our intense focus and our dedication to the cause of Klal Yisrael's struggle, against an implacable enemy, but also the worldwide struggle that we're going through right now. This burgeoning, anti-Semitism and the irrationality of people and their incapacity to understand things that are very elemental and to articulate anything. And anybody who heard the hearings that that went on, that were almost comical, but tremendously sad. People who don't have supposedly university presence of the greatest academic institutions, on the planet, who are fumbling around and trying to find all sorts of ways, not to say things that are just basic, and it really is very disturbing. And this war, sadly, is taking place on many fronts, but it's also very eye-opening, and it underscores very much the special legacy that we have as a people, and that's really what Hanukkah is all about. That's what the Chashmonaim fought for against all odds, and the Nes Pach Hashemen, revealed that their vision and their milchama, and the Hallel and the Hoda'ah and the also the Lo Lisanos, but especially the Lo Misped Bahon, all of that is really the legacy of Hanukkah, and it should inspire us. It should give us hope. Number one, in a very difficult time, and a really a spiritually and physically existential battle, for our future. But with a sense of understanding the past, whether it's Purim or Hanukkah, both. In this case, there are elements of both. But the Ribono Shel Olam has been very kind to us as a people, and through tefillah and hishtadlus, constructive help financially and encouragement and anything else we can contribute. All of this, Samir Tashem, will lead to a proper conclusion, and this Hanukkah, assumes special proportions, I think, because of it. So I want to wish you all a Hanukkah Sameach, and on all levels. And, may the lessons of Hanukkah continue to inspire us as we move forward in challenging times. Next week, we'll continue with Masechet Yevamos. Thank you.
Chanukah Sameach and Chodesh Tov.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.